Welcome to Suri Cheating Story, where we share true stories of betrayal in love. Our channel brings heartfelt, real-life experiences from those who have endured the pain of infidelity. Whether you're facing challenges in your own relationship or seeking to better understand the complexities of love and trust, Suri Cheating Story is the place for you. Subscribe now to explore the emotional depths in the path to healing with us. The afternoon sun poured through the windows of Cafe Bellamy, casting golden light on the polished wooden floors. The air smelled of roasted coffee beans, cinnamon pastries, and freshly baked bread. Conversations hummed in a soft, familiar rhythm, a mix of idle gossip, business talk, and the occasional laughter of friends catching up over espresso. Everything was as it always had been, until the door creaked open. An elderly man stepped inside, his frail frame hunched against the weight of years. His clothes were worn, his shoes so scuffed they were barely holding together. Yet it was his eyes, tired but still sharp, that held a quiet dignity, a reminder that he had not always been invisible. His name was Joseph, but in his younger days, they had called him Joe. He had seen decades pass, had fought in wars, had built a family, and had buried those he loved. Now at 89 years old, he was nothing but a forgotten shadow in a world that no longer made room for men like him. Joe shuffled toward the counter, his trembling fingers digging into his pocket. He carefully placed a handful of coins on the counter, straightening his spine as much as his aching bones would allow. "Just a sandwich, please," he said, his voice hoarse from years of quiet suffering. "The cheapest one you have." Across from him, Marcella, the cafe's owner, looked up from the register. She was a middle-aged woman with sharp features, the kind of person who had seen it all and had little patience for weakness. Her lips curled slightly as she looked him up and down. "This isn't a charity, old man," she scoffed, arms crossing over her chest. "If you can't pay, you can't eat." Silence fell over the cafe. A few customers stole quick glances, but no one spoke up. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others simply ignored the scene entirely. The world had taught them not to get involved. Joe swallowed the lump in his throat. His stomach growled audibly, but the hunger was nothing compared to the burn of humiliation. "Please," he whispered, his fingers tightening around the coins. "I can pay something." Marcella let out a sharp laugh. "We don't serve beggars here." The words stabbed deeper than they should have. Joe lowered his gaze, his fingers curling into a fist. He had spent his entire life working, sacrificing, building something out of nothing. And now, he was reduced to this. The murmurs around him turned into a quiet, mocking laughter. "Just leave already," someone muttered. Joe stood frozen, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a mountain. Then a voice cut through the air. "That won't be necessary." The cafe fell silent. All eyes turned toward the entrance. A woman stood there, tall, poised, and unshaken. Dressed in a crisp suit, her dark brown hair perfectly styled, she looked as if she had just walked out of a high-powered meeting. But there was something in her eyes, something sharp, something unyielding. Her name was Isabella Sinclair. And at that moment, she was the only person in the room who refused to look away. Marcella blinked, thrown off by the woman's presence. "Miss Sinclair, she began, but Isabella held up a hand, silencing her. "I didn't ask for an explanation." Her voice was calm but firm, each word measured. She reached into her purse and placed a crisp $50 bill on the counter. "This should cover his meal, and a coffee, and perhaps a warm pastry if you have one." Marcella hesitated. She wanted to push back, but Isabella Sinclair was not a woman to be challenged lightly. With an annoyed huff, she snatched the bill and turned toward the kitchen. Meanwhile, Isabella turned to Joe. "Sit with me," she said gently. "Let's eat together." Joe hesitated. He had never been offered kindness without a catch before, but something about the way Isabella looked at him told him this wasn't pity, this was something else entirely. Joe hesitated, his weathered hands hovering over the chair across from Isabella. He wasn't used to kindness, especially not from someone like her. A woman dressed in tailored clothes who carried herself like she owned the world had no reason to acknowledge a man like him, let alone share a meal with him. But there was something in her steady gaze, something that told him this wasn't about charity. This was something else entirely. Slowly, he lowered himself into the chair. His fingers still trembled slightly, his shoulders tense, as if expecting someone to tell him to get up and leave. But no one did. Instead, A waiter approached, cautiously placing a hot sandwich and a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. Joe's mouth watered instantly, his stomach tightening as the smell of freshly baked bread filled the air. It had been too long since he had last sat down to eat a proper meal. "Take your time," Isabella said, her voice softer now, less commanding than before. She picked up her own cup of coffee, watching as he wrapped his fingers around the warm ceramic. Joe hesitated for only a moment before taking his first bite. The bread was soft, the melted cheese still warm, and for the first time in what felt like ages, he felt something close to comfort. For a while, neither of them spoke. The cafe had gone back to normal, the hum of conversation resuming as if nothing had happened. But in this small corner, something had changed. It was Isabella who finally broke the silence. "Do you live nearby?" she asked, watching him carefully. Joe swallowed, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand before answering. "No." She didn't push for more, but the slight tightening of her jaw told him she already knew the answer. "Where do you sleep?" she asked instead. Joe let out a slow breath. "Wherever I can," Isabella nodded, as if she had expected that. "Do you have family?" At this, Joe hesitated. He looked away, his fingers unconsciously gripping his left wrist, adjusting something beneath his sleeve. Isabella caught the movement, and then she froze. Her sharp gaze landed on the watch peeking out from under his sleeve. The worn leather strap, the faded silver face, the unmistakable engraving on the back. And just like that, the cafe disappeared. Her breath caught in her throat, her heart slamming against her ribs. "Where did you get that watch?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Joe blinked, startled by the sudden shift in her tone. He looked down, his calloused fingers absently running over the metal surface. "This?" His voice was quiet. "It belonged to my son. He always wore it, until the day he..." He stopped, as if the words were too painful to finish. But Isabella had already heard enough. Her fingers clenched around her coffee cup, her breath shaky. She knew that watch, because she had given it to him. Her chest tightened as a wave of memories crashed over her. Laughing under city lights, whispered promises of forever, the warmth of his hand in hers. And then, the accident, the day everything fell apart. She looked at Joe, really looked at him, and for the first time, she saw more than just an old man. She saw a father mourning a son. She saw a pain that mirrored her own. Joe must have noticed the change in her expression because he frowned slightly. You knew my son?" The words hung between them, fragile and heavy all at once. Isabella swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I loved him," she whispered. And for the first time in decades, Joseph felt his heart skip a beat. Joe's breath hitched. His fingers twitched slightly as he stared at the woman sitting across from him. "You loved my son?" His voice cracked, filled with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Isabella nodded slowly, her normally steely gaze softening, clouded by something far more vulnerable. "Yes," she whispered. "More than anything." Joe's old, weary heart clenched at her words. His Emmanuel, his boy, his son, the boy who had grown into a man with dreams bigger than this town, the boy who had always been too soft-hearted, too kind for his own good, the boy he had lost. How did you know him?" Joe asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Isabella swallowed, taking a deep breath as she let herself remember, something she had spent so many years trying not to do. "We met when we were young," she said softly. "I had just started working at a small boutique in the city. He used to come in all the time, bringing donations for the orphanage down the street. At first I thought he was just another wealthy kid with a hero complex." Joe gave a small, sad chuckle. "That sounds like him." Isabella smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "But he wasn't just playing at being kind," she continued. "He meant every single thing he did. He wasn't like the others. He saw people, the way they wanted to be seen. And he saw me." She paused, her throat tightening. "And I saw him." Joe's hands trembled as he clutched his coffee cup, his grip so tight that his knuckles turned white. "He never told me about you," he admitted. "His mother, she would have never allowed it. She had her own plans for him. Plans that didn't include love, didn't include happiness, just status." Isabella's jaw tensed. Victoria. The name tasted like bitterness on her tongue. Joe sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. She never wanted Emmanuel to love anyone who wasn't suitable. Someone from our world, Isabella scoffed, shaking her head. I was never enough for her, was I? Joe hesitated, then shook his head. Number, but that had nothing to do with you. Victoria, she couldn't see past what she thought our life should be. A heavy silence settled between them. Outside, the world moved on. People laughing, cars passing by, coffee being poured. But inside the cafe, time had stopped. What happened? Joe finally asked, his voice hoarse. Isabella closed her eyes for a brief second, bracing herself for the memories that would never stop haunting her. We were supposed to leave the city that day, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Joe's heart skipped a beat. Leave? Isabella nodded. He wanted to go somewhere new. Start fresh. He told me he didn't care about the life his parents wanted for him. He just wanted me. Joe felt his chest tighten. But we never made it out, Isabella whispered. The accident, it happened so fast. 1 minute we were driving, the next everything was upside down. She let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she placed them flat on the table. I woke up in the hospital and Emmanuel, he was gone. Joe didn't realize he was crying until he felt a single tear slip down his cheek. He had known his son died in an accident, but he had never known the full truth. He had never known that Emmanuel died running toward love, not away from it. He loved you, Joe whispered, his voice breaking. I wish I had known. Isabella nodded, blinking away her own tears. I wish he had told you. For a long moment they sat in silence, two people bound by grief, by a loss that neither of them had ever truly healed from. And then Isabella reached forward, covering Joe's shaking hand with her own. He may be gone, she said softly, but we're still here. Joe let out a shaky breath. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. The silence between them was thick with memories. Some shared, some unspoken, but all tied to a man they had both loved and lost. Joe's fingers trembled slightly as they traced the edge of his coffee cup. His mind was flooded with visions of his son as a boy, running barefoot through the garden, laughing as he chased fireflies. Emmanuel had always been full of light, and now he was gone. Isabella was the first to speak. Joe, she said softly, her voice measured, careful as if speaking too loudly might shatter the moment. What happened after Emmanuel died? To you, to Victoria? Joe let out a slow, painful breath. Victoria was never the same, he admitted. She blamed herself, but more than that, she blamed you. Isabella's jaw tightened. She had expected that answer, but hearing it still hurt. She thought if he had stayed with us, if he had lived the life she had planned for him, he never would have been in that car. Isabella swallowed hard. She had lived with that guilt for years, wondering if Emmanuel would still be alive had she made a different choice. But she had never considered that Victoria had carried the same weight of grief, only directed it elsewhere. She hated me, didn't she? Isabella asked, her voice quieter now. Joe sighed. She didn't hate you, Isabella. She hated what you represented, the life he wanted that didn't include her control. The truth is, Victoria never knew how to handle love that wasn't on her terms. Isabella sat back, exhaling slowly. I always thought she saw me as the enemy, she admitted. That's why Emmanuel never let me meet her. I never understood why. Joe nodded solemnly. He loved you too much to put you through that. He knew his mother well enough to know she would never accept you, and he didn't want you to suffer because of it. Isabella's heart ached. She had spent so many years believing she had been the villain in Victoria's story. But now she realized Victoria had simply been a mother who had loved too selfishly, too possessively, and it had cost her everything. Joe's voice softened. After Emmanuel died, Victoria shut herself off from the world. She barely spoke to me. She stopped eating for days at a time, lost weight, and just faded. She became a ghost in our home. Isabella could picture it. The once proud and proper woman, dressed in fine clothes, her chin always tilted up, her eyes always sharp, now wasting away in her own grief. She refused to leave the house at first, Joe continued. She kept his room exactly the same, never moved a single thing. She would sit there for hours, just staring at his bed, as if expecting him to walk through the door again. And then, when reality set in, When she realized he was never coming back, she turned on me. His voice cracked slightly. She said it was my fault, that I should have done more to stop him, that if I had been a stronger father, I could have kept him away from you. She convinced herself that I had failed him, and in the end, she pushed me away just as much as she pushed the world away. A heavy silence settled over them. Joe ran a hand over his weathered face, sighing deeply. I tried to hold things together for a while, but when you lose a child, there's no manual for how to survive it. You wake up every day with the weight of it pressing down on your chest and you carry it, hoping one day it won't crush you. But it does. Isabella swallowed hard. What happened to your home? She asked gently. Joe's face darkened. We lost it. The debts piled up, and I couldn't keep up. I lost my job shortly after Emmanuel's funeral. I just couldn't function anymore. I wasn't the same man I used to be. Employers don't have patience for a man drowning in his grief. He chuckled bitterly, though there was no humor in it. And Victoria? She didn't care. She was too deep in her own misery to even notice the walls crumbling around us. By the time she realized we were being evicted, it was too late. Isabella felt a lump in her throat. So you've been on the streets ever since? Joe nodded slowly. Some nights we found shelters. Other nights, we just found a bench and held on to each other for warmth. And eventually, we got used to being invisible. Isabella's heart ached in a way she hadn't expected. And now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Where is she? Joe looked away, his hands gripping his worn-out coat. She's waiting for me, he whispered. In a park not far from here. We have nowhere else to go. The weight of those words settled heavily between them. Joe had once been a father with a home, a family, a life. Now he was just another forgotten soul, surviving day by day with nothing but memories and regret. Isabella felt something stir deep inside her, something that had been locked away for far too long. She had spent years grieving alone, believing she had lost everything when Emmanuel died. But now, sitting across from Joe, she realized they had both been suffering in silence. And maybe it was time for that to change. She took a deep breath and pushed her chair back. Come with me, she said, her voice firm. Steady. Joe blinked, confused. Where? She met his gaze, determined. To find Victoria. Joe stood still, his body heavy with the weight of years spent living with regrets. He had walked through life, day by day, waiting for something, anything, to give him a reason to hope again. And now here he was, standing on the edge of something he never thought would come, a chance to fix what had been broken, to confront the past that had defined so much of his existence. Isabella stood beside him, her presence a sharp contrast to the heavy silence between them. The soft whisper of the wind rustled through the leaves of the trees in the park, but it couldn't shake the stillness that had settled over them both. It was as though the very air held its breath in anticipation, waiting for the moment when everything would change. They walked slowly through the park, the path winding between ancient oak trees, their gnarled roots pushing up through the pavement as though they too were holding on to something deep below. Joe's steps were uncertain, his body old and stiff, yet his heart seemed to beat with a newfound urgency. Isabella walked beside him, steady and sure, but her mind was elsewhere. She was already thinking about what they were about to face. Victoria. It had been years since Isabella had seen her, since that time when Emmanuel had still been alive, and the world had still felt like a place where dreams could come true. But that had all changed. Victoria had always been strong-willed, opinionated, and fiercely protective of her family. She had never been easy to please. And after the accident, everything had crumbled, not just for her, but for Joe as well. They reached the bench where Victoria sat, hunched over with her coat pulled tightly around her. The once immaculate woman was now a shadow of her former self. Her hair was unkempt, gray strands breaking through the darker locks that had once been so carefully styled. Her eyes, once sharp and calculating, were now dull, staring into the distance with a lost, vacant look. She was holding a small tattered bag in her lap, her fingers gripping it tightly as though it contained the last remnants of her old life. When Victoria saw Joe, her face remained expressionless for a long moment. Then slowly, her eyes flickered with recognition, but it was not the warmth of love that flashed across her face. Instead, it was the recognition of someone who had survived too much and couldn't bear to face the person who had once been her partner in life. Joe took a cautious step toward her, his voice low and hesitant. Victoria. For a moment it seemed as though she didn't hear him, but then her eyes slowly shifted upward to meet his. A brief flicker of something passed through her eyes. Pain, perhaps, or anger, or maybe even both. Joe, she whispered, her voice hoarse. Her gaze then drifted past him to where Isabella stood just behind him. Isabella was a stranger to Victoria, but the presence of the woman standing there, so calm, composed, yet so familiar in the way she carried herself, seemed to unsettle Victoria more than Joe's appearance had. You brought her with you? Victoria's words were sharp, tinged with bitterness. She glanced at Isabella once more, a look of disdain crossing her face. Isabella took a deep breath, knowing that the moment they were facing wasn't one that could be solved with quick words or simple gestures. It would take time. It would take understanding. Part 1 ends here, but the story has not stopped yet. The next developments will have many surprises, surging emotions that you cannot miss. In which direction will fate push the story? What awaits ahead? Stay tuned for the next episode so you don't miss the most important details. Thank you for watching. See you in the next part.